Hello, welcome to this virtual session on humanizing employee ownership, ways to make it feel real. I am really looking forward to having this conversation with you, and I hope you'll add in some questions in the chat or follow up with me or any of my colleagues here about the NCEO about this topic. We're passionate about it, and we'd love to be helpful to you as you look to find ways to make employee ownership real at your company. All right, let's start with one piece of housekeeping, which is this. Let's talk about the requirements for getting continuing education if you're joining us virtually here, as you obviously are. First, you need to be signed into this virtual platform under your own email, and that needs to be the same email that you registered for this conference with. Second, you'll need to fill out the three polling questions that are going to come to you throughout the course of this 1 hour webinar. And then third, you're going to need to submit that continuing education survey. All right, that's it. That's the housekeeping. Let's dive in. The big advantage that you've got when you're trying to make employee ownership feel real to your workforce is that it really does. Employee ownership makes the world better. There is gobs of research evidence on that, spread it out over decades now. So you can make a really firm case and be really confident that when you say employee ownership is a real thing that can make your life better when you're talking to your colleagues at your company, you can be confident that you're right. Let me just share a couple highlights with you now. There's all sorts of research across all sorts of dimensions about the impact of employee ownership on better company performance. Employee-owned companies tend to grow faster, be more productive, and survive longer. They're just simply less likely to go bankrupt or out of business or be acquired. The That shows up, that financial success, the performance of the companies shows up for the benefit of all employee owners. There's great research now that says that employee owners have greater financial security, and that's measured in lots of dimensions, including income, but also, and maybe most importantly, household wealth. Employee owners, on average, are simply better off than non employee owners. And that shows up in things like lower quit rates. And with the big topic of 2022 being the great resignation, lower quit rates can be a huge difference maker for companies if they don't have to spend as much hiring new people and training them. But it's also a huge difference maker for employees because if you're in a place where you want to stay, that not only is a really good indication that it's a better, more satisfying job, but it keeps your life from being disrupted. Long-term employment is a great ticket to financial stability. And of course, in terms of our communities, employee ownership keeps businesses here. It makes sure that they're owned by people who live in the communities where the businesses operate. Now, you may have your ownership spread in a lot of different states, but you're not owned by the public market or a private equity firm in another location. So I'm not going to go over all these research findings. If you'd like, there are tons of great research about NCO research and research by others that documents this. There are sessions at this conference that you can go to. There are lots of online resources, but you'll whatever you read, you'll find the same thing that employee ownership makes the world better. But that's not enough. It makes your job a whole lot easier knowing that employee ownership makes the world better. But that only helps if people feel the realness of employee ownership. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So I'd like you to think for a minute for you or for people you know at your company. You may have seen it where suddenly or gradually employee ownership starts to feel real. Now, I'm going to literally pause here for a minute and ask you to think about that, either for yourself or someone that you know well at the company. What did it look like when employee ownership started to feel real for you? If you want to pop these in the chat box, I would love to read them if you want to email me about them later. But take a minute and think about that. I'm going to pause right now And then I'm going to share with you some of the most common things that we here at the NCEO see about what it takes to make employee ownership feel real. All right, thank you. Now, I'm just recording this now, so I can't see whether you sent me chats, but I hope you have. And if you haven't, then I hope you will. But I'd like to share with you some of what we've seen about what people say about employee ownership starting to feel real for them. One of the things that we often see is that if someone starts to act like an owner, then the feeling of being an owner starts to follow. So if you build in some processes, maybe it's a mini game, or maybe it's a huddle, or maybe it's an innovation process, or participating on a communication committee, doing something like that can start first, and then the feeling of ownership can come later. I bet a number of you know stories about people who may have been cynical about employee ownership, got recruited, what's our phrase now, voluntold to join a communications group, and eventually they became a real champion. We've seen this happen all the time, and I think many of you probably have as well. Another way that it happens is it sneaks up on people. The company announces that they're employee owned. They don't really know what to think about it. Maybe they're actively just a little bit skeptical or even cynical about it. But over time, they see how the company follows through, how it acts employee owned. They see examples, just little bit. Maybe it doesn't even penetrate their consciousness, but over time, they start to feel a pattern where the company is itself acting like employee ownership is real, and they gradually start by osmosis to incorporate that same attitude. So sometimes that's how people start to feel like owners. And then a third example of how it happens is just click. It's immediate. You've probably seen people like this too, maybe even in a job interview or an onboarding process where you say, "Hey, we're employee owned and here's what it means to us." And the person immediately latches onto this concept and says, "Yeah, that's what I was looking for." Or that's why I applied to work at this company. For some people, it's just immediate, like a gut reaction. So, if these are some of the ways that employee ownership starts to feel real, what can you do as people inside employee owned companies right now to encourage that feeling of realness? Let's think a minute about your theories of change. That's sort of a consultant phrase, but it means what's your idea about the process by which people start to feel like owners? Let me share several with you because there are a lot out there. And here's the thing, a lot of them, even though they may say different things, they can all be true because all of us come to employee ownership in different ways. All of our companies, all of us as individuals can come to a different path through employee ownership. Let me share four with you here. And I'd like to know, as you're going through these, which one of these grabs you most, seems like the best fit. The first is that you need to do two things. You need to build the credibility of your employee ownership plan. Maybe that's under having people trust that an ESOP is really a legitimate thing. And there you might be looking at the history of ESOPs or Congress's intent for why they made it possible for companies to set up ESOPs. Or maybe it's about other companies that people know of that also have ESOPs, maybe in the community or in your field. So, thing number one, credibility. Thing number two is connection to action. And that's kind of a parallel idea to the idea that people start to feel like owners when they start to act like owners. So, if you can do things to connect people to actions they take to start to feel like owners, then that might be a way to get people to feel like owners. And then the last part of this theory of change is that the thing you need to do is provide an identity. You need to say, you're not acting like an employee owner, you are an employee owner. It's part of your identity. If you're an employee at this business, part of who you are is a business owner. Part of who you are is a member of a team that collectively has an ownership interest in the well-being of our company. When people stop feeling like a job is something I do and that employee ownership is something I am, that can be what the third element under this theory of change for how you make people feel like owners. So here's a second theory of change. It's a much more straightforward one. The first thing you need to do is explain to people the financial implications of employee ownership, what it does and does not mean for them. Second, give them information like transparency into the business and your ownership plan and how it works. And then third, give them a voice. How does what they say have an impact on the company, what it does, and their colleagues? The third theory of change is a phrase I bet you've seen, WIIFM. For those of you who don't know, that stands for what is in it for me. And this is the idea that employee ownership is about uh, dollars and cents. It's all about the Benjamins. Let me suggest that this is the only one of the theory of changes that I think is definitely inadequate. What's in it for me is an essential part of getting people to feel like owners. It's that credibility part of the first theory of change, it's the financial part of the second theory of change, but it doesn't connect to the other parts of those theories of changes. And that's what's missing from what's in it for me. Start there, but don't stop there. Here's the last theory of change, and this is the one I'm going to use as a focal point for the rest of this presentation. Now, a lot of the things in these other theories of change get incorporated into this, but I like this because it's easy to remember. It says you need to do three things to get people to feel like an owner. You need to get them to think about the value of their ownership. You need to get them to understand valuation, and you need to get them to understand the values that are behind your company and your employee ownership. So we'll talk more about each of these three, but just briefly, value is a dollar amount that they can expect from being an employee owner. Valuation is the mechanism that translates what they and the company and its strategy do and how that translates into the value of a share in their account. And values are the non financial, the human side of things that what we care about, that we show respect, that we're all a team together. So let's talk about value, valuation, and values. We'll start with value. So I'm going to share with you a lot of different smart ideas that we've seen our member companies do to communicate value to their workforces. So let's start with the most basic one. Here's a great example. This is a company called Van Meter Industrial. They have an annual gathering and they're an electronics distributor. So they created this fantastic display. It's huge. It's person sized, and it worked a little bit like one of those lottery machines where the numbers kept the one-armed bandits, where the numbers spin around and slow down and slow down and slow down. And so they got people to sort of see this a lot of electronic buildup to the stock price, and it was a great way to not only get people to really remember the stock price, but to build up a real level of excitement about the stock price and what it is at Van Meter. So this is a great idea. I love it. Another idea is to take that value and engage people in it beforehand. And I bet a number of you do a guess the stock price contest. Here's just one example from a company that this is from our communications source book, and it's a good example. So with the guess the stock value price, you can simply ask people to guess, as this company largely does, or you can give people a bunch of the information that's going to be input into the valuation process. So they start working through some of the mechanisms of valuation inside their own head. And that'll lead them to have questions, maybe to ask and learn more about how valuation works. And we'll get to valuation in a minute. But both of these ideas are really powerful, I think. But here's another approach. Now, I'm going to step back for just a second and make sure all of you know about a new program at the National Center for Employee Ownership. It's the Innovative Communication Coalition. It's got a website, a little spot on our website, and we'll have blog posts that show up for them every now and then. There's a link to this blog post, and you can Google it on our website, find it there. But these were four highlights that came out of one of the conversations of the Innovative Communication Coalition. And the first two of them speak directly to this idea of how you communicate value. The first is that instead of talking about retirement, Focus instead on wealth building. Retirement feels like something that you can safely ignore for a whole bunch of decades, which feels like your whole life if you're in your 20s, maybe your 30s. But wealth building is always relevant. Nobody wants to not do wealth building. Talk about the ESOP as a way to build wealth, and you're much more likely to get people's attention than if you're trying to convince them to start planning their retirement. Second point that the Innovative Communication Coalition got into was how the account value can be a better thing to focus on than stock price. Now, I think stock price is great. Those contests and the celebration can be a great thing to focus on. But in your employee to employee communication, if you focus on account value, then people get a much broader sense of what the ESOP can mean for them. It can give them a sense of how large the dollar value is, how it's growing, what's contributing to the dollar value, because it's not just stock price. Some of the other things that the Communication Coalition focused on were the six-letter word for something every ESOP company does, which is trivia, of course. And we've got some ideas for how you can build your own trivia program. And then another thing, invite guests. Now, this is another way to give people a sense of value. Invite a guest, whether it's a retiree from your own company or someone who's about to retire from another ESOP company. Have them come talk to your workforce about what the ESOP meant for them. That's another way of talking about value. Okay, here's another way. I mentioned some of that research and I just wanted to share a little bit of it. If you go to this website, ownershipeconomy.org, you'll see a very in depth piece of research that is a national representative sample of a segment of the workforce, millennial age workers. And what this study found is that if you look at millennial workers across the country, that if you work for an ESOP company, your net household wages are 33% higher. And more interestingly, your net household wealth is 92% higher. One nice thing about sharing data like this is it doesn't make any promises or commitments about what the future of your company is going to be like, but it does give people a sense for the potential of employee ownership to change their own personal balance sheets. But here's my favorite way to talk about value. You can use words, you can use numbers, you can use charts. But instead, what if you have this picture of Rob Zaccaro? Rob is an employee or a former employee owner at Web Industries. He was an ESOP participant for a long time. And this is what he's able to do because he was an ESOP participant. He's got a comfortable enough retirement that he can get back to what he was doing before he started working at Web Industries, which is, in his case, literally being a rock star. He was in a band that opened for Aerosmith at one point, and the ESOP gave him the freedom to get back to that in his retirement. You'll have stories like this at your own company as well. Another way to get people to really focus on value is to ask them. They're going to need to understand something about the ESOP, not all the minutia, not all the things that go into the summary plan description necessarily, even, but they need to understand enough about the ESOP so that when they look at their account statement and see a dollar value that's in their ESOP account, they've got some credibility about why that money is there and why they should have faith that they understand the ESOP well enough that they know it will be coming to them at retirement. So ask them. Ask them how well they understand the ESOP. Ask them if they feel comfortable with it. You can get really useful data. This is a question from the NCEO's ownership culture survey. We ask people how well they understand ESOPs. It can work for other forms of employee ownership, of course. But this question is how well people understand the ESOPs. And you can ask the question just like this in your own company and see how it changes over time. One thing that might be useful is to see what the answers look like at other ESOP companies. It's a little bit hard to know if having a majority of your workforce agree or strongly agree with this question is good or not. What you can see from the comparison data is that if you look at over the overall companies who have taken the survey, that a majority of ESOP owners do feel either they strongly agree or mostly agree that they understand the ESOP idea. If you're at a company where it's sort of 50-50 between strongly disagree and strongly agree, that might feel good or might feel bad. But if you look at the comparison data, you'd likely say to yourself that you've got room to improve, that you've got to do more so that people understand and appreciate the value of their ESOP account. And that appreciation of their ESOP account is part of what it takes for people to understand the value. All right. So let's say you're in a place where people don't understand the ESOP, don't feel great about their understanding of how the ESOP works. There are tons of tools for how to get people to understand the ESOP and the value of their own account. Let me share just one with you here, and I'd encourage you to go to other sessions where people will do more. But one really simple tool that we've liked doing is something that answers these questions. These are some of the main things people need to know when they want to understand the value of their own account. How does it grow? And there you want to tell people not just about stock price, but also about new shares being added to their account, how they get there, and uh, and uh, and then the other assets that may be in their account. People will want to know if they might lose the value in their account, and there you can tell them what vesting means and what the federal requirements are for how ESOP accounts the rights of ESOP participants. You might also, and this will be a bit counterintuitive, let them know what happens if the company does fall on very hard times, what the value of their account would be. It's good for people to understand the reality of stock, which is a high return investment, but also does have more risk than a diversified portfolio. Now, there's a lot to say about diversification, and we've got another session that talks directly about how to explain why ESOPs being only in company stock is not a bad thing. It's still a good thing for workers, but it's a good thing to acknowledge because people will have heard about some of the stories where ESOPs didn't work well. Get in front of it by talking to people. You can talk a little bit about when they'll get it, what form they'll get it in, and about how risky it is. Here's a good example of how to do that. You can take a hypothetical person, let's say they started at the company 8 years ago, 7 years ago, step through what happens each year as they get another year of service at the company. What changes to their vesting? When do they become a participant? How many shares are added to their account? What's the total accumulated number of shares in their account? You can do a very similar chart. And one thing I like to do is take this chart uh, live on my laptop, projected on a screen, and enter data live in front of people as we're doing a session, so they can see exactly how these numbers work together in real life. You can do a similar chart to show people what happens when they get to retirement age and when they start getting payments out of the ESOP from their for their retirement. Okay, that is value. There are some ideas for what companies have done to communicate value. I hope that was useful to you. The next piece in this triad that I wanted to talk about is valuation, which is the process by which what the company does, what all of us working at the company do every day, translates into the value of shares of stock in the ESOP. And I think this is one of the most overlooked opportunities that companies have when when they're communicating. It's a complicated issue. Many of you have seen valuation reports. They're 60, 70, 80, 90 pages long, dense tables, many charts, huge, a table of contents that fits on more than one piece of paper. And that's tempting to just not cover that. But the fact is, you can take valuation and make it simple. I'd like to give you one example of a really simple approach to communicating valuation and then a slightly more complicated one. Here is one of my favorite examples. I rarely talk about communicating an ESOP without using this example because I think it's brilliant. It's not new. This is from 2008 and a company called Van Meter Industrial. You may remember them from the huge numbers that they used to introduce their stock price. They created a program they called Your 2 Cents Worth. And what they did is they had their communications committee spend some time with the valuation report, boil it down to its most essential essence, which vastly oversimplifies how valuation works, but it does get at the key issue, which is that any profit you can take gets hit by a multiple, and that multiple times the profit is one way that we calculate share value. In the case of Van Meter Industrial, that all boils down to, if all else is equal, if any employee can add $10,000 of profit to the company's profitability for that year, that roughly equals out to 2 cents per share of stock. Now, that if we have any appraisers or trustees watching this, you may be squirming a little bit right now. I apologize. I know this is oversimplified, but it does get at that essential idea that profit translates into stock price after being hit by a multiple. And that lets Van Meter do some really cool things. They had, at the time they rolled this out, 300 employees. So let's do the mental exercise where all of those 300 employees figure out a way to add 10,000 bucks to the bottom line in a year. That means they have suddenly added $6 to the price of each share. And that lets them do some really nice things. That way, they not only see the value that gets translated into their own account. Every share in their account is now worth $6 more, but it also tells them, when we all work together and we all add 10,000 bucks of profit, we all get richer. The values of everybody's account goes up by $6 per share. It's a great way to get people all pulling together in the same direction. Borrow this idea. I think it's brilliant. Hats off to Van Meter. Okay, so let's take another example, this time from the public markets. Now, the public markets have an effect on your company, even if you're privately held. And I bet everybody listening to this presentation works for a privately held company. That just means your shares don't trade on a stock exchange in New York. What happens in public companies is you can see from day to day, from minute to minute, how the financial world sees the prospects for this business. Now, here is a graph showing the stock price of BP, the petroleum company. Now, this is an old example; it's from 2010, but you can see that starting on April 20th, it started going down. What happened on April 20th was that news leaked about the New Horizon disaster, where oil was leaking from the New Horizon platform in the Gulf of Mexico. The news leaked out kind of slowly. It actually took several months as we gradually learned more about what was going on, learned more about how it was going to affect BP, the scope of their legal liabilities that might arise from it. So you can see the market behaved totally logically. It went down because of all these new reasons to think that BP wouldn't be as profitable as they thought it was. As BP's profit goes down, the value of its shares go down, just like in your company. But here's what's interesting. At the same time, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Conoco had similar patterns. They also saw decreases in their stock price at the same time as BP was going down. They didn't have any financial interest at all in that New Horizon uh, oil platform. Now, their stock prices are down a lot less because they're going to be affected less directly. But what you can see is that what one company does affects other companies. And there are lots of reasons. You can think of some of them yourself. Like maybe it's going to hurt the market for oil. Maybe there's going to be more regulation as a result of the New Horizon spill, and all that would affect these companies as well. The fact is that what happens in one company to one company's stock is partly the result of what it does itself, like its own expected profitability, and partly the result of what's going on in the market as a whole. And that's the case for your company as well. Some of it is under your control. Your meaning you and everybody at the company, including your business plan and your strategy and how effective it is, and also including the effectiveness of how you do all the big and small things that make the company hum along and be successful. But it also depends on things outside your control. So you've got to be ready for those things outside your control and ready to maximize your ability to have a positive effect on the things that are in your control. That's the public market. Let me make another analogy which might be useful for you as you think about the value of your company. When you buy a stock, it's a lot like buying a house. When you buy this house, for example, you can see exactly how much it's worth on the market. Now, maybe you'll get it for a bit more or a bit less. Who knows? But there's a house. You can learn a lot from this house, and you can, and a site like Zillow or any of these other real estate sites can help you see why the house is priced at that amount. They can also help you understand what your house might be worth if your house is somewhere in the same neighborhood or similar to this house. You can see comparable sales, you can see which ones are higher or lower, you can see how much having another bedroom drives up the value of your stock, of your house, and you can see the location. You can look at how comparable these assets are and how important the differences between those other houses and your house are in determining the stock price. The same thing happens with the value of your company. You can look at comparable companies, and if you are in the oil industry, maybe those public companies we looked at would be among your comparison companies. And you can also look at some of the differences to see where your company is better or worse than those comparison companies. All that will have an effect on the value of your shares. So, for example, if Exxon can make the case that we've done a much better job than BP did in protecting the safety of our oil drilling platforms, they might find that their value does better, it takes less of a hit when BP has its disaster New Horizon site. So you can do things comparable. You can make sure to protect the value of your assets. You can make sure the comparison between you and other companies is as positive as possible. And that'll help make sure that you maximize the value of your share. One other point to make from the housing market: the value of a house is that $495,000 that we saw on the prior slide, but the value ship of the ownership of that house can be quite a bit less. Let's say you borrow $300,000 to buy that house and you make a silly decision and you decide to sell it right away. You wouldn't get $495,000 for that house. You get $495,000, take 300,000 of it, pay back your loan, and you'd have $195,000 left. Just the same way, the value of your company is is like the value of the house. Then you subtract the value of all the debt your company has to see how much the value of the ownership of your company is. The value of the ownership of your company is the value of its stock. So the easy correlation there is the more debt your company pays back, the more the greater the value that is available for the shares. Paying down debt is a great way to increase the value of your shares. And in fact, a lot of companies see the value of their shares decline immediately after taking an ESOP and putting an ESOP in place. That's not because anything nefarious is going on. That's not unplanned. It happens all the time. It's because when the company creates an ESOP, it often takes on a lot of debt, and it'll take a bit of time to work that debt off. Paying off that debt is a built-in factor driving up the value of your shares. I'm not going to spend much time with this because the income method gets a little complicated, but you can use a housing analogy to talk about how to value a company as well. If you own a house, you can rent it out. Let's just say you rent it out at 12,000 bucks for the coming 6 years. The way that turns into the value of the house on the open market is we figure how much those future rents are worth. And the further in the future they are, the less they're worth now. So you can look at the income method. There's some present value accounting that will tell you how much that future rent translates into the value today of that house. But the way you calculate present value has a lot to do with how risky your house is. Is it in a flood zone? Is it in a volatile rental market? Is it in a growing or shrinking community? Are there factors that drive up or down the riskiness of people living there? And the fact is, your present value might be radically different if you have a higher risk rate. Let's say that present value two is for the same house, but in a riskier neighborhood. The same thing applies to your company. The riskier your future income is, the less it's worth. The more you can do to make the valuation firm believe in the quality of your projections, the lower the risk is going to be, and the higher the value of your equity is going to be. So, how do you make the risk less? You meet your performance goals. You're realistic about them. You have a deep management team. You have people ready to fill in any key position. You have a broad set of people who are capable of contributing to the success of the company so that the company is not vulnerable to any one single person in how well it does. So, there are a lot of things wherever you are in organization can do can contribute to not only making that 12,000 bucks of projected income higher, but also making it less risky. The more predictable you can make your future income, the higher value your company is worth. All right, we've talked about value. We've talked about valuation. Let's spend just a few minutes talking about values. That's a trickier topic. It's far more personal, and it's something that's so different from company to company. So I'll just share a few thoughts and examples here. The purpose, though, of talking about values is that if you want people to feel like owners, it's not simply about dollars and cents. It's not simply about the value. A lot of it is about agency, about the impact that we have through valuation on the value of the company. But it's also about the rest of us, the non financial part of us as human beings, about why we care about showing up to work, about why being part of a work community matters to us. And that's where these values come in. A couple thoughts here. One really smart way to talk about values is to make it mutual. What can employee owners expect from the company? That can be a thing that makes being an employee owner at a business feel worthwhile. These are things that I can expect and benefit from by being an employee owner. And that may be things like a share in the financial success of the company, the right to have a voice and to question business practices, or the right to have access to information about how the company is doing, and including how my employee ownership interest is doing. So that's rights, and rights are great. If you pair rights with responsibilities, these are things that the company can expect from employee owners. These are the things that make it worthwhile for the company to share these rights, worthwhile for the company to be employee owned. These are the things, these responsibilities are the things that make the pie bigger for everyone. These are the sources of employee ownership advantage. So, sure, if having a right to share in the success of the business makes it good for me to be an employee owner at your company, then having me feel an obligation to contribute to that financial success makes it good for the company, makes it good for all the other employee owners at your business. And these two things are a logical pair. It just makes sense that if I've got a right to share in that financial success, then I should also contribute to that financial success. If I've got a right to question business practices, then I've got a responsibility to help find solutions too, to be part of the solution. Now, maybe sometimes the most important thing I can do is share that there is a problem and make sure that somebody at the company is dealing with it. But to the extent that I can help find a solution to that problem, that makes everybody better off. If I've got a right to access it for information, that's great. It's even better if I use that information to make the company better. This is a statement of rights and responsibilities from a company that is no longer employee owned. Actually, they're a PR firm, and they did a really nice job of phrasing it. We've got articles and articles on our website of examples of rights and responsibilities. You'll want to customize these to yourself. And oh, by the way, you can also use that ownership culture survey that I mentioned to measure rights and responsibilities and to see how well in balance they are at your business. Finding that balance can be a terrific way to measure and build your ownership culture. And when you get to the point where people equally feel a high level of rights as owners and a high level of responsibilities as owners, that is one great way to define a strong ownership culture and a place where people really feel that employee ownership is real. Okay, that's one example. Another is Harpoon Brewery, and I love this example. Harpoon Brewing is a company that makes Harpoon beer. They're based in Boston, Massachusetts, my former stomping ground, and they are a great company. You can sort of get the vibe from this picture of them in a room. Now, what I thought was so smart about the one of their ideas that I'm just about to share with you is that they realized that if we're talking about values, then values show up in stories. Just the way people have passed on myths and legends to communicate the values and the cultures that they come from, companies can do the same thing, and they can do it with stories. One of the recurring themes has been that employee ownership becomes real through stories. And those stories are best when you hear them from your peers. Now, there's a room for stories from the person who sold the company to an ESOP. That is incredibly useful. People need to know the story behind why our business is employee owned. But stories that talk about why I, as a non management employee owner, feel like an employee owner. Here's, back to that slide at the beginning. This is the moment, this is the process by which I started to feel employee ownership is real. Here's a little anecdote. Here's an interaction with a customer I had. Here's a piece of feedback I got or a thing I saw someone do. And that made me realize this is not a normal company. This is a company where I am involved, a company that I'm a co owner of. So, what Harpoon did is they decided to double down on this idea. They said, hey, people are already telling stories to each other. Those stories are the basis of the culture. Let's help them do it well. Harpoon hired the Moth. Now, some of you may be familiar with this. This is a program, a radio program where people, non professional storytellers, get up in front of an audience, tell a true story, and they share it with the audience. It's a whole contest about how to tell a story well, who tells the most effective story. And the people who produce the Moth are fabulous storytellers, and they go around and tell people how to tell stories. And Harpoon Brewery hired them to coach a bunch of their workforce through how to tell stories better. Those storytellers led other Harpoon Brewery employees through the storytelling process so that they had built a whole cadre of people who had ready made stories to communicate to their coworkers, but also to their customers, to any reporters who might call, to colleagues, to spouses, to everybody about why Harpoon is special, different, and employee owned. This is a great idea. I strongly recommend it to you. One way it can make a concrete difference is if you do what New Age Brewing has done and set up a really important example for where people can tell their stories. This is a still from a video, and the people you can see there are the CEO of the company. He's a Ken Baker. He does a fantastic job of telling the employee ownership story and how his dad set up this company. The person next to Ken is a state representative from Pennsylvania, where where New Age is located. And he's here to hear stories about New Age. All the people on the sides of this table are employee owners at the company, and they're there to tell their stories. And you can bet that the state senator is listening to those stories because these are his constituents. He wants to know what they care about, what makes their lives better, and he's looking for stories that he can share in the Pennsylvania legislature to talk about what good public policy looks like. This is a great example. You could imagine a similar situation in your own company. Maybe it's not a state representative, maybe it's a journalist or a professor at your local university or anything else, any other thought leader, a member of your chamber of commerce. Um, all of these things can help build stories for employee ownership. And I think all of us know this, but nothing makes you feel more like an owner of something than showing someone around. If you can imagine these employee owners leading their state senator on a tour of their work floor, that and portraying how it's their work floor, how they work here, what they and their colleagues do, that's a guaranteed way to make people feel more like owners of their business. So let's talk about this. Is employee ownership good? You know what I think? I think it's good. But the real quantitative, methodological, sound way to answer this question is to say, compared to what? What's the alternative to being employee owned? You can call that the CTW, the compared to what. And if you think about this, if the ESOP did not own your company, who would? You know something about the values that animate your company as an employee owned business. What would the values of the person or the entity that owns your business be if it wasn't the ESOP? Of course, it depends who it is. Maybe it would be someone with stellar values that you'd feel perfectly aligned with and comfortable with. But maybe it wouldn't be. Maybe it would be a large firm or a private equity investor. Maybe it would be a public company that was looking to buy you for strategic reasons. It might not They might not have the same goals and ambitions for your company as the people who currently run it do. So what would that look like? Let me share one story with you that it speaks to me. You, if you've been around since for a while, you might remember back to 2008 when Pepsi cans looked like this. Um, in 2008, Pepsi spent $1 million to create a new logo and hundreds of millions of dollars on an advertising campaign to announce their new can. They did not claim that there was anything different about the content of the can. Same Pepsi, different can, different logo, different look. Hundreds of millions of dollars. And you know what? It was worth it. They got their money back from how they portrayed a purely cosmetic change. So here's where you've got an advantage because there's no difference between the Pepsi in one can and the other, but there is a huge difference between your company and what your company would look like if somebody else owned it. Pepsi spent hundreds of millions of dollars leveraging nothing into having a big effect. You should invest enough money to properly communicate why your business is different. It's going to take an investment. All the things we've looked at so far in this session are examples of things that will cost some money to outsiders, will cost time, uh, both for the people who deliver these presentations and organize them and design them, and for your whole workforce to sit and learn and see what happens, and really invest in learning how employee ownership makes your business different. The point I think that comes out of this Pepsi example is that money can take something and magnify its impact. It can magnify its impact from zero to real. Think what it can do when there's a real difference in your business. Now, the prologue to this story, as you may have seen just last week, Pepsi introduced its brand new can, which I have no idea how much they spent on, but there's the new Pepsi logo, which I'm sure did not come cheap. You can do better than Pepsi. You're working with a much better starting point than the same cola in different cans. Okay, so we've talked about value, valuation, and values. Let's talk about how you take that and once you've used this framework to create a sense where people do or are starting to think that employee ownership is real, how do you preserve that for the long run? And I'd like to give you two sets of examples. The first is about around how to turn it into action, because I think that insight right at the top of this session is really worthwhile. That if people do act like employee owners, it cements the feeling of being employee owners for the long haul. So how do you turn it into action? That's as different from company to company, as each company is different from each other. But there are lots of things you can do to take that feeling of ownership and turn it into something different that people do at their jobs from day to day. It could be as simple as playing the great game of business or other form of open book management. It could be the kind of thing where you set up some mini games so people can contribute to a company goal. They can see what they do, how they that contributes to a particular 3-month goal, like improve shipping accuracy or reducing waste in the production or preserving a solvent, whatever it is. It'll be different for every company out there, but you can create these mini games that do a great job of getting people involved in actions. You can also take some bigger picture steps. At the NCO, for example, we've got a high involvement process that we adapted from our great friends at the Great Game of Business, and we get everybody at the NCO involved in setting up our 4-month, 1 year, and 3-year plans. You can do the same thing. There are some great examples of companies that have built a broad-based approach to strategic planning into how they build what they do, how they build their strategic plan. Then everybody feels engaged in it. A third way that you can create action is by building a lot of opportunities for people to participate. A- And that might be something like some of our companies do a Shark Tank like process where any employee can say, "Here's a change that I think would benefit the company," and then they do something a whole lot like the show Shark Tank, where you've got a few people from the company who evaluate all the proposals, and people from inside the company put their proposals into a business business proposal format and present it. Everybody at the business has an opportunity to translate an idea into an action, and then it can happen as fast as during the Shark Tank session that action gets approved. It might be approved for immediate action. It might be approved for research or further development. It might be sent back with the idea that here are a couple things you need to work on before it's ready for us to take action on. Or it might even be, this is a great idea, but it won't work. And unfortunately, here are some reasons why. In any event, closing that loop takes people from feeling like an owner to having an ownership idea to having a direct impact on the business. All right. So that's action. Action is going to be one of the clues that builds your employee ownership and makes it last for the long term. Nothing is as invigorating and engaging as feeling a sense of agency, of feeling like you, regardless of where you are in the company, can have an idea or take an action that affects the whole company and affects everybody that you work with, all your work colleagues. Okay, let's talk about the one last piece I want to cover before we wrap, which is be in this for the long haul. When you're looking at employee ownership, when you're looking at making employee ownership feel real, it's going to take a while. Some people will have that click that we mentioned at the beginning. They'll be engaged right from the top. Other people, it'll grow on them slowly. They'll start as skeptics, they'll see how things pan out. Other people may never get on board. And that's okay. You can have a successful culture where some, but not all, of the people in your business are actively engaged and feel like employee ownership is real. Be patient. Expect that it'll take some time. For a number of our member companies, they say that the first year, the first 2, 3 years, people see the amounts that go into their account, and they don't really get to that threshold of why I should care about it. What's in it for me? They haven't got past that. But once you start to get into later years of the ESOP and account balances start going up, then that threshold question of what's in it for me becomes a little bit more obvious, and companies and employees can start thinking about all these other things: the valuation and sense of agency, the values of the business, how they can contribute to the business, and employee ownership starts to feel a whole lot more real. So be patient. A corollary to being patient is to talk with your peers at other companies. I mentioned the Innovative Communication Coalition. That's a great way to do it, especially if you're involved in helping create the communications that build people into feeling like owners. Your peers at other companies can not only react to your ideas and challenges, they can share what they're doing and what works for them. They can also help you have a sort of a realistic sense of what to expect 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 25 years into your employee ownership. When you're talking with your peers, it's a great way to simply feel more at ease about how your ownership culture is going. One of the recurring lessons we get from people who come to our conference is they look at some of the stellar speakers that talk about the amazing things their companies are doing and they say, oh, we're nowhere close. And that's okay. Don't be intimidated by the champions. Talking with your peers at other companies can give you a sense for what it looks like in the non-champion companies. Maybe your company becomes a champion, but maybe it takes 10 years. Maybe your company never becomes one of the amazing champions of employee ownership, and maybe you just sort of have a solid, moving along, non-spectacular but very effective culture. That can be fine. Don't be intimidated by the champions. Keep yourself moving forward and be patient, and you'll build a stronger culture. One way to be patient and to stay in it for the long haul is to track small signs. Those can be things like often, when you're just walking around listening to the conversational buzz, do you hear some of the phrases and ideas that you've introduced? How often do you hear people talk about employee ownership? How often do you hear them mention the strategic plan? Just kind of jot that down. See if you can see a change over time as people become more familiar. How many people show up at your company's annual shareholder meeting if you have one? The percentage of people might be an interesting indicator of how much people feel engaged. Another way to be in it for the long haul is to avoid reinventing the wheel. Instead of saying, hey, let's do event X, build an annual calendar, then reuse that annual calendar, adapting it over time. That'll make it easier for those of you who are in charge of communications. It also gives people a sense of trust and confidence that there's a rhythm and a pace and something they can expect and count on when it comes to employee ownership and building ownership cultures. And that leads right into the last way to be in it for the long haul, which is to build a communications committee. Don't do this alone. Get a bunch of people at your company who all share responsibility for building a sense of ownership, for making employee ownership real. I hope a number of you listening to this are in a communications committee or something similar to it. I hope that you come to events as a committee. I hope that you do things as a group to not only educate yourselves and give yourselves ideas, but to enjoy each other. That I've mentioned Van Meter Industrial a few times. One of the things they did that made their committee so effective is they took time. They got to know each other and they spent a year learning about employee ownership and the ESOP before they had anything concrete that to show for it. They invested in themselves and they made an incredibly effective group that's been one of the most effective communications committees I've met. All right. So these are some ideas about how you can make employee ownership feel real at your business. I've mentioned this before, but I'd warmly encourage you to contact me or any of my colleagues at the National Center for Employee Ownership. We'd love to talk to you about all this. We'd love to share ideas. We'd love to put you in touch with your peers at other employee owned businesses. Some specific ideas that may be useful, you can meet our director of education, who is a new hire for us, Lindsay Isaac. She's here to help. The Innovative Communications Coalition is a great tool. If you're a CEO, you can join our CEO network. If you're on the finance side, you can join our finance peer group. We have a communications committee crash course if you'd like to learn about the ESOP basics and some of the best practices in employee ownership. All of these things can give you a leg up and help you be in this employee ownership for the long haul. Thank you so much. Thank you for being part of this conference, and I'll look forward to talking with as many as you as many as you as possible in the not too distant. Thank you.